I have to start by saying I'm not a lawyer. And on our panel, we have a few other members who are not lawyers. So it's going to be a good combination of an industry and a legal perspective. And I think that is exactly the kind of perspective we need in trying to understand this whole area of connected health. I personally wish we had connected health. We have been arguing for greater connection between the different silos that have existed in the healthcare delivery system in this country in particular, creating all kinds of inefficiencies. We have argued for greater integration for a very long time in the different aspects of the healthcare provider space. We have argued that there should be more sharing of information that would allow to have the patient at the center rather than the practice of defensive medicine or practice within specific specializations. And now we are in a situation where we find ourselves in a unique position where, partly because of the Affordable Care Act and its focus on patient-centered outcomes, and partly because of the changes in technology itself, especially in the area of sensors, as well as in the area of connectivity, that we are actually beginning to see this tremendous potential of connected health actually becoming a reality. And at the same time, especially as we all heard in various panels today, healthcare data is something that we consider very personal and very private. And we are having great difficulty in accepting our loss of privacy in precisely being able to provide that kind of a connectedness that would actually improve in so many ways our healthcare delivery process. So without further ado, I'm going to request our first panelist, Heather Patterson, who has done a lot of empirical work in the area of what expectations we have from on the privacy issue on healthcare, to kick it off and talk about it. But let me do a brief introduction. You do have the bios, but I'm not sure what tradition you've followed here, but let me just do a very brief introduction. Heather Patterson is a postdoctoral fellow at New York University, where she researches legal, social, and cognitive aspects of technology-related personal information sharing, particularly in the realm of self-tracking, self-quantification, and connected devices. So I think she's perfectly fit to discuss this topic. Heather.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Can everybody hear me? I'm actually on. All right. That's okay. How about now? Is that better? All right. I can. All right. Thank you for the nice introduction, and thanks to Fordham Law School and the Center for Information Technology Policy for inviting me here today and for hosting. Is that one better? I'm just going to keep talking. Okay. So I want to kick off today's session on connected healthcare by first noting that the Internet of Things in the health ecosystem occupies an exceedingly broad space. So it encompasses everything from connected pacemakers and endoscopy pill cams, which I was just reading about this morning, which are kind of terrifying, to clinician-oriented cell phone apps that allow, for example, OBGYNs to monitor fetal heart rates from afar, and to consumer-facing behavioral tracking tools like fitness and wellness sensors and apps. And we've been talking about those a little bit today, particularly with respect to the Fitbit. Last time I checked, there were 200 of these types of sensors and over 97,000 self-tracking health apps available for purchase or download. And the vast majority of them are actually geared toward consumers. And so what I want to talk about today very briefly is research that we've been doing at NYU with respect to consumer expectations of privacy in this self-generated health data. So we've been conducting empirical work by sitting down with users of the Fitbit. So this is a small selection of the larger population. We bring in Fitbit users, we interview them for 2 hours at a time, some people in San Francisco, some people in New York City, and we can talk about methods later after the session if you want, but basically I talk with them one-on-one following a semi-structured interview guide. I give them well-established questionnaires with some kind of standard privacy questions and some new questions, and then we also engage in a card sorting task whereby I give them multiple pieces of information, 20 different pieces of health information, and ask them to indicate who they would feel comfortable with possessing that information about themselves. So ranging from physicians to family and friends to insurance companies to their employers to law enforcement, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. And I let them put those cards in piles, and then they just talk through various reasons for why they're comfortable or uncomfortable with those entities possessing particular kinds of information about them. So we focused on Fitbit users because the self-quantification movement is so popular right now. You talked about patient-centered health or user-centered health, and I think there is a real sense that people are excited about using these newfangled devices that are relatively inexpensive, that they can go to Best Buy or Amazon or the Apple Store and buy, and suddenly become more aware of their health-related behaviors, and particularly their sleep, which is something people are really quite interested in. And they can do that with very little cost to themselves. And so we realized this was a very popular tool. So this is what we focused on, but the conversation of it ended up being quite a bit broader than just the Fitbit, because as it turns out, people who use Fitbits use other tracking tools and apps, and they have a lot of thoughts about this kind of information sharing anyway. So one of the interesting things about the Fitbit, this morning we talked about the kinds of data that the sensor itself can collect, but it's not just the sensor that's collecting this information. The websites that are associated with the device, so the particular profiles that the users establish about themselves, kind of incentivize the collection or sharing of even more information. So they create places for users to manually record the identity and nutritional content of all of the foods that they eat for every meal throughout the day, for example, including brand and portion size and calorie count, as well as a lot of other health metrics like their resting heart rates, their exertive heart rates, their systolic and diastolic blood pressure, their morning, afternoon, and evening blood glucose levels, as well as information about moods and allergies and anything else that people would like to talk about, because there's a space for diary entries on Fitbit. And this is all tied, of course, to the very specific information that users record when they establish their account. So name, date of birth, city, zip code, email address, height, weight, stride length, pregnancy status, often a personal photo, a fitness goal. So there's an enormous amount of information about them within these profiles. When I interview them, I assess kind of the way that they engage with the devices, how they use them, how often they wear them, what their expectations of privacy are in their information flows, and how they go about establishing or exerting some control over those information flows. And we talk about whether they succeed or fail. So I want to talk just about 3 major findings. This is ongoing research, but I've been struck by how consistent the findings are. There's a very clear consensus that's falling out of these data. So far, I'm sitting on about 50 hours worth of interview data, and the stories that people are telling are so similar that I'm thinking that it's time to kind of stop these interviews and actually take this data and parlay it into national level surveys so that we can actually draw some inferences on a broader scale about user information, privacy preferences, and health data. The first thing I want to say, the first major finding is that at first blush, consumers are very trusting and enthusiastic users of these devices. They wear them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If they leave home without them, they will usually go home and get them unless they're too far away from home, because they really want an accurate record of their daily activities. They work very hard to meet particular fitness goals that are set for them by the company, usually to achieve 10,000 steps in one day. One woman I interviewed jogs in place as she blow dries her hair in the morning to make sure that she kind of reaches that goal. Other people will come home late at night. It'll be 11:30 at night. They'll see they're at 9,000 steps, and they'll go out into their apartment stairwell and they'll climb up and down the stairs until they reach 10,000 steps. This matters to them, both to meet their own goals and because they are kind of signaling to the people that they are friends with on the Fitbit website that they are healthy. So there's competition going on, a little gamification of fitness, which I think can be fantastic for society. They form Fitbit friendships online with both real-life friends and with perfect strangers. And they use the tools very honestly. They are incentivized to be very frank and very forthcoming about their information, particularly their height and their weight and their stride length and things like that, because they want to maximize the value of the tool they're using. They're not buying an obfuscation tool. They're buying a tool that will track them and give them very accurate feedback. And so they interact with it honestly, which kind of puts them in a vulnerable position. Also, these tools are marketed as lifestyle tools, not serious clinical medical tools. So they may not even be thinking, you might think, about this as medical data that needs to be protected. So there are a couple different incentives to be very forthcoming. So what appears, though, on the surface to look like an apparent lack of concern for privacy, or maybe just naivete, I'm finding when I actually push on it a little bit, actually has very clear limitations. The people that I'm speaking with are, in fact, exquisitely sensitive to the contextual appropriateness of health information flows. They care very much about which parties get access to particular types of health data about them, and they're very articulate about that. So although I don't think they've really figured out what kinds of inferences can be drawn from the disparate types of data collected by the devices, they still express these very strong preferences about who should get access to the information. So, for example, the vast majority of the people that I've spoken with are very willing to share large, broad swaths of information with doctors and family and friends and university researchers, basically because they are operating under this kind of guiding notion that that information is going to be safe and secure. Those are parties that operate kind of under principles of confidentiality. They understand the information transmission principles in play, either because their family members are close to them and they know they won't violate their trust, or because doctors have kind of a moral responsibility to not share information, and indeed also a legal obligation to not share it. And researchers also have to abide by, internal review boards, strictures, and they have to keep data safe. So people are kind of aware of this. But they flag their discomfort with the idea of many, many kinds of health data. So most of the ones on my list being shared in a number of other situations. So I'm just going to name a few of those because I know I'm going over time already. They balk at insurance companies getting access to just about any data that isn't strictly related to the payment of their claims for very specific reasons. They worry about their insurance premiums increasing. And that's a very pragmatic concern, but almost everyone mentions it. They're very uncomfortable with the idea of employers getting access to their health information. And they're sensitive to the idea of hiring and firing and promotion discrimination. So, and even just being perceived differently at work than they would like to be. So people mentioned with surprising regularity that they know that if their employer, or they think that if their employer gets access to information about their weight or their eating habits, that this might signal an inability to exercise the kind of discipline and self-control that employers value in the workplace. Or information about sleep cycles, if that becomes known to their employers, this may signal poor productivity or poor lifestyle management. Information about moods may signal depression or general instability or unreliability. Information about family histories of cancer or diabetes or heart disease or distressed babies, to pick up on the recent AOL example, may signal that they're going to increase the company's health insurance costs and put them at risk of being let go. I think surprisingly, and something we don't think about a lot, is that they're uncomfortable sharing their health data. At least remember, these are the people that I spoke with. So this isn't necessarily true of the entire population of HIPAA users or of self-trackers. The people that I spoke to are uncomfortable sharing their health-related data with non-health-related social networks like Facebook and Twitter. So when they log their information on Fitbit, they can tweet out their Fit stats to Twitter or to Facebook. No one that I spoke with was willing to do this. They really distinguish between health social networks, which are kind of safe and closed spaces to talk about their medical condition or fitness goals, and other kinds of social networks. What they say is they're concerned about being perceived as narcissistic or as kind of signaling that they're just the kind of people who would track. That's embarrassing to them. And they also don't want to suffer reputational harm if, for example, they gain more weight than they would like. They are really negative about pharmaceutical companies getting access to their data. Those seem to be generally just disliked entities. They feel like those companies are going to take advantage of them and market to them, and they don't want to receive ads, although that's actually less of a concern than some of these other things that I've flagged. But just kind of generally across the board, I'm seeing that users do care very much about privacy, and these privacy preferences are very contextually grounded. I have one more finding. Do I have enough time? Okay. Very briefly, the last finding is actually fairly expected. That's in order to operationalize these preferences, people attempt to manage their privacy settings online, and they very typically fall short for a couple of reasons. The first one we've talked about today, it's an ongoing problem. Privacy policies themselves are too complex for them to evaluate these data flows appropriately. So they can't even really tell what information is going where and under what circumstances. And from a user perspective, these are fairly misleading. So there's one example of that. There's actually a pregnancy app that's available called Glow. It's a free tool. It tracks users' sexual activity, basal body temperature, emotional health, menstrual cycle markers, like really personal stuff like cervical mucus texture. It predicts the days in which a woman is most likely to be fertile, and it sends her and her partner daily reminders and suggestions that they need to be active that day if they are trying to conceive. So if you read that app's privacy policy, though, it says in all capital letters, all caps, it says, "We don't sell or rent your personal information to third parties." I mean, it's very big attention-grabbing text. But in the following paragraph, in smaller print, it says, "We share your personal information with employees, affiliates, vendors, partners, and third parties as required to offer the services." And then further down on the page, it's additionally revealed that the company shares your personal information to market products and services to you, and it shares other transactional information and experiences with affiliates. Okay, all of those things may be technically true simultaneously. I promise users don't understand those distinctions, don't care about them. So even if people try to find this information, they're stymied. And the second part of that is the controls that users actually are given access to by these companies to channel the information flows, if they are given the opportunity to do that, are themselves often very confusing and not particularly usable. And we can talk about that more later. Sorry for going so far over time.
Thank you very much, Heather. Soon they're going to find out what kinds of images turn you on and be able to send those out to the partners as well. There seems to be, we've talked mostly about consumer generated information and the Internet of Things being affected by that. But there are 4 kinds of information that I think I see in the healthcare industry in the whole area of connected health. One is what I would call broadly the syndromic surveillance information, where what is your influenza-like indications that you might get and what type of illnesses you might get. And many cities, actually, New York City collects information to do this syndromic kind of surveillance. And then we have the ambulatory services, the EMT and others, who get all kinds of healthcare information for purposes that they need to know what kind of special conditions, things like MedAlert and others would provide information to the EMT services. And then you have the point-of-care decision support systems that are also helping the provider in making better information, better decisions based upon health information technology. And finally, there is what we've really been talking about a lot, the whole idea of promoting preventive care and promoting home care, both of which are likely to increase with the wellness issues growing in what we see as a post-Affordable Care Act regime, time period. So my question to Frank Pasquale, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Pasquale. Yeah.
Pasquale, sorry, thank you. To Frank Pasquale is do current HIPAA and high-tech regulations, if they're properly implemented, take care of most of these categories or only of the last, of all except for the last one on promotion? But before I ask Frank, just 2 words about him. Frank Pasquale is a professor of law at the University of Maryland, co-chair of the law school's Empower Committee on Inter-University Initiatives, and serves on the advisory board of the Justice and Legal Thought in Law and Society program. He works currently on legal implications of genomic registries, and his research agenda focuses on challenges posed to information law by rapidly changing technology, particularly in the healthcare, internet, and finance industries.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks so much, Falguni. And I just want to say that this is the issue in terms of HIPAA and high tech is very interesting in these areas. And what I want to focus on, though, is instead of the healthcare information that is traditionally kept by covered entities and sort of covered by HIPAA, I want to focus on a lot of the information that is now being created and the type of inferences that Steve Belvin brought up in his question for Commissioner Brill, and how we deal with those types of inferences. And I also just wanted to start out by saying, sort of questioning one of the premises that I think I've heard several times today, which is about an almost worshipful attitude toward the abilities of this data. And I think that, I mean, we heard, that driving could predict credit, or credit could predict driving, or other things like that. In order for me to take seriously a lot of the claims that are made by, say, a lot of the entities that are controlling the data from the Internet of Things or trying to draw inferences from it, I would need the safeguards of the scientific method. I would need sort of independent third-party auditability in order to really look at this type of data before I would accept it. And I would say that society as a whole should try to have a lot more skepticism toward it. And some of the proposals that I'm going to put forward today that sort of are inspired by HIPAA and high-tech's role in the healthcare sector, I think are applicable to the Internet of Things precisely because the stakes are so high, right? If we really believe that everything is connected to everything, and I do see that point, then we have to be really careful about making sure that this material is legit, and that we know, for example, the provenance of data. We know where it's coming from. For those of you who followed sort of debates within science, I mean, Victoria Stodden up at Columbia has complained about the irreproducibility of a lot of computational science. That's just in a purely scientific context. And we have, there's a means, motive, and opportunity to exaggerate the predictive powers of a lot of these things, right? If I find out that there's just noise between the driving and credit data, that's not a very lucrative finding. If I can somehow massage it or try to find some sort of relationship, maybe there is. And not only that, and the theme of my book, The Black Box Society, is that this is data that it can not only be massaged, but it can become self-fulfilling prophecies. I mean, in the credit context, for example, if you have a bad credit score and you're paying 15% interest, it's pretty likely that maybe you're going to be more likely to fall behind on a 15% interest rate than on, say, a 2 or 3 or 4% interest rate. So we have to be extremely careful about the validity of this data and third parties' abilities to look at it. And I mean, Brian Nozick, Ioannidis, other people have all talked about this problem in science. It's a problem for corporations too. Where do I go from there? Where I go from there is I am very inspired by the role of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology and CMS in implementing the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act of 2009. Because these entities consider it within their bailiwick the importance of having authorized testing and certification bodies that if there is a vendor that's going to be selling health information technology to doctors, for them to qualify for the subsidies under the Meaningful Use Program, they have to assure that there is proper security, that there is sort of proper, that there are things built into those sorts of medical records. And I think that we need to move more towards that sort of licensing model for even these entities, the Internet of Things entities. I think we need to move to ex ante. And lest that be sort of decried as radicalism, if you look at the work of Glenn Weil and Eric Posner calling for an FDA of finance, they say for complex financial instruments, there should be testing of them and sort of like almost the way that we test drugs ex ante. I think a similar case could be made for lots of the things that we've heard about today. I not only draw inspiration from the authorized testing and certification bodies that are part of the meaningful use framework for high tech, I also draw inspiration from the business associate agreements that are required by law to be drafted between a covered entity under HIPAA, a business associate, and any downstream subcontractors of the business associate. Because what is understood implicitly within that regime is that it is just important to make sure that there are protections for data all the way down the stream. So I can't just, as a hospital, hire Cerner, and Cerner can't just go hire Amazon Web Services, and who knows how far the chain might go, and just say, oh, I've washed my hands of it. There's upstream vicarious liability up that chain in case something goes wrong when people who are, say, the covered entities don't do the right due diligence on the downstream providers. So my sense is that if we have this type of a framework in place, I think that's very important. Another thing, just to back up Scott Peppett's very smart points about restricting use. People will say that's stopping innovation. Well, I think in some ways, maybe it is, but I think in other ways, some of the things that are most invidious that we've heard about today are not really forms of productive innovation, they're forms of discrimination. And if we do not have a political economy of data that can make rigorous distinctions between things that are actually productively adding to human welfare and things that are sort of accelerating the segmentation and stratification of society, then, I mean, why not just give up? We really have to be able to draw those sorts of lines in our law and at the very least in the sort of economic and social scientific analyses of those matters. So with that, I think that I would say is that I really think my bottom line is that there's a lot of room for learning within our sort of the FTC context and the state level context from health authorities who are regulating health data, just in general, because if we really believe that everything predicts everything, then everything's a form of health data. And I think that if that is really the case, and I'm convinced by Pepe and others about that, and Ohm and others, then we can learn a lot from them. And I would just close by recommending the work of Bob Gelman, who wrote a blog post called, Comparing the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology and the FTC on Privacy Enforcement. Very revealing, interesting post. He praised ONC a lot. It was a bit unfair because ONC has a lot more statutory authority than FTC. But I think that what that post, the subtext was that both state level enforcers and the federal privacy enforcers, that there are so many great models within the health privacy context, and that really is the place that we might want to look next in terms of inspiring more rigorous and more fair privacy protections. Thanks.
Thank you very much. the much of the concern that I see happens out of the fact that so much of the data and stuff that's put out there does not have the rigor of academic or scientific rigor that you would like to see us have. And therefore, it's particularly with this growth in the area of the sensors and this area of wellness, they're getting this huge upload of decentralized data that's coming up there without any moderation, without any kind of a way of verifying what is being said. That's really become very problematic. So I'd actually like to see if there is also the FDA in the discussion, and would like to see whether the FDA, which actually does control devices, as long as they're used for medical purposes, and that remains, to be seen how we define that, whether the FDA can actually add to this situation, making it easier for us to have connected health. And in doing that, I'd request Bradley Thompson to actually respond to that. And I would like to introduce Brad, who is a member of the firm at Epstein, Becker, and Green. There he counsels medical device, drug, and combination product companies on a wide range of FDA regulatory, reimbursement, and clinical trial issues. At the firm, Mr. Thompson leads the medical device regulatory practice, the clinical trials initiative, and the Connected Health Initiative, and he serves on the firm's National Healthcare and Life Sciences Steering Committee. Brad, would you just enlighten us a little bit on what the FDA can or cannot do and your views on what you've heard thus far?
Well, thank you. In your introduction, you asked me if FDA can help with this. And that's an interesting question, because really FDA isn't viewed as all that helpful by most people who they're regulated by.
Yeah, I studied drug discovery, and I can actually attest to that.
Yeah, so I don't have good news, that FDA is going to lift all ships here. Really want to do is talk, I hate to sound like the glass is half full, but talk about some of the challenges that connected health present. Before I do that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with FDA law or know kind of the basis upon which FDA regulates, but the statute is actually technology agnostic. The statute doesn't really identify with any specificity the technology that it regulates. Rather, what they do is they regulate anything that a company sells for an intended use, which is medical, an intended use which is in the diagnosis or treatment of disease. And so I've taught just north of here up at Columbia at the law school, and one of the first days of class I'll walk in and I'll take out this little stick, and you probably can't see it, it's about 5 inches long. I'll put it on my desk and I say, I make these, does FDA regulate them? And I'm really kind of a sadist, but for the next hour I'll make them grill me to figure out what my intent is as the seller, whether it's a popsicle stick or whether it's a tongue depressor. And it really all depends primarily on how I promote it, what I say about it, what meetings I go to in order to promote it, and so forth. It is, for those of you with law degrees, you appreciate that intent can be kind of a fuzzy concept, right? As to what exactly a person's intent is. It depends much less on design characteristics. Here, design tells you nothing. Now, if I were selling a pacemaker and I was claiming that it was a grapefruit, you might say, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of design evidence in that pacemaker that suggests you don't intend people to use it as a grapefruit. But barring that, you really are guided by principally what people say about it. Now, appreciate just how general a jurisdictional scope that is. We talked a moment ago about clinical decision support software. There's no law that says that a medical device needs to touch a person, right? Software that resides on a PC and does nothing but analyze data can be a medical device. In fact, there's a lot of examples of software that does exactly that. Some of the more sophisticated are software that will look at a medical image, say an MRI, and help a radiologist trying to find out if there's something going on there that they need to worry about. All it's doing is looking at data. bits and bytes. And all it's doing is making a recommendation. And based on that, it's actually a class 3 medical device, which means it gets the highest level of FDA regulation. All right, so that's the scope. So what are the challenges that we're facing in this area? Well, there's actually several of them. The first one is figuring out what's a medical device and what isn't when everything's connected to everything else. There's a basic rule at FDA which says if it's connected to a medical device, it is a medical device itself and regulated to the same degree. Now that's a 30, 40-year-old rule, and it makes a lot of sense. Back when you had a transducer that was plugged into an ultrasound machine, it made sense to regulate the transducer the same way as the machine, right? They don't work. If one of them doesn't work, they both don't work. They wouldn't serve their intended purpose, all right? But in the Internet of Things, where everything's connected to everything else, what's the medical device now and what's not? Now you could say, well, some of it's just communication equipment, but if it fails and the whole system fails and care is impacted by that failure, doesn't that impede the effectiveness of the medical device? All right? And so go back to my test. What is it intended to be sold for? Let's say I make a medical grade router, and there are those, right? They're actually hubs, digital hubs, that are sold specifically for consumers to put in their homes that they will use to tether their blood glucose meter and all sorts of personal medical devices. A blood glucose meter, by the way, is a class 2 medical device. All right? All I'm doing is selling it as a medical grade router. I'm not specifying what it's to be used for, okay? It creates some real ambiguities about, well, is that a medical device? And if so, how is it regulated? What if someone ends up connecting it to their pacemaker to download information ultimately to their cardiologist so that they can monitor how that patient is doing? What if it's a simple weight scale, but what you're using it for is to manage the possibility of congestive heart failure, right? Where slight variations in weight can have a significant impact on what you ought to be doing as a patient. So the accessory rule and figuring out what is and is not a medical device is a big issue. Notice that's not just hardware, that's software, right? As I understand software, I'm not a coder myself, but as I understand it, software continually interacts with other pieces of software on the operating system, if nothing else, but over this connectedness that we're talking about. So when our software is so inextricably connected that the joint effectiveness means that they're all regulated FDA articles, it has a big impact, right? Because getting through FDA can be expensive and time consuming. So it's not just an academic question, it's a very important commercial question that companies are facing. So the bigger issue then too is once you've decided what is a medical device, how does FDA regulate it? Well, that's where this systems idea and connectedness is really kind of blowing FDA's framework. Number one, when you go to FDA to get a product approved, they basically do a cost-benefit analysis, or risk-benefit, I should say, analysis, not cost, sorry. And that depends on being able to define what those risks are. Well, if you sell a generic product, you don't know in what system it will be used. I'll go back to my medical grade router thing. You don't know in what system it's going to be used. So you really don't know what the risk is. If it's connected to a weight scale for someone who's just trying to lose weight, that's one kind of risk. If it's ultimately connected to a pacemaker, that's a very different kind of risk. So if the FDA doesn't know that when you go to them, it really kind of messes up their world because they no longer know really how to assess the risk. On the back end, then, of regulation, when something goes wrong, the FDA has legal regulatory authority to grab you by the throat and say, fix it. Well, the problem is when an Internet of Things goes wrong, whose fault is it? Who exactly bears the responsibility for doing whatever is necessary to fix it, for reporting to FDA that it's broken in the first place? If there are 12 things that are all connected, you might believe yours did nothing wrong, when maybe the issue is interoperability. Maybe it's no one person's fault. Maybe the two just didn't speak together effectively, and that doesn't mean it's one person's fault. But how does the FDA system cope then with that? The FDA system is built upon a responsibility of manufacturers to report when stuff goes wrong. But if no one knows whose job it is to report, it really kind of messes the system up. So I have to say FDA isn't in a position to help anyone. They're probably more in need of help on this topic.
That they always seem to be. And nevertheless, I think this whole idea of a system regulation is a very interesting one, and I hope we can probe that a little further as we go go into the discussion. But you know, one thing this does kind of make me pause a little bit and look at industry. And I've been, you know, I'm in the business school. We have a center on healthcare innovations. We look at device innovations. We look at drug discovery, and we look at clinical trials. And one thing kind of I get very concerned about is to what extent is industry really capable of self-regulating. If we look at a combination of this whole notion of privacy by design, encryption and other privacy factors embedded into devices, a system by which we can begin to trust certain sites more than other sites, can we come up with an ecosystem that allows us to not have the negative effects on innovation that some people argue this increased regulation might have? And I'm going to defer that question to you, Russ. But before I do that, Russell Jones is partner cyber risk services, life sciences and healthcare sector, Deloitte & Touche, and has over 21 years of experience working with healthcare providers, biopharma companies, medical device manufacturers, and public sector clients, addressing a wide variety of information security, data privacy, and IT risk management issues. Russ, would you pick that up?
Sure, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'll start by, I remember a quote that came from a client of mine several years ago, a senior vice president, very large global medical device manufacturer. And he, on the subject of security in their devices and privacy, he said, security is a bunch of bull crap. And if it wasn't, we would have heard about it from our clients, our customers. And I think that was very telling to me. I mean, that actually led us to do a study that we conducted. We went out and met with, you know, a number of large health systems and device manufacturers and some of the regulatory bodies. And it's a complex issue, and the reason it's complex is, if you look at the way device manufacturers, or even, you know, manufacturers of mHealth technologies, if you look at their methods of how they develop these great technologies, and the whole process of, you know, being able to, if it's a regulated device, what they have to go through to get through FDA approval, and if it's not, you know, a regulated device, you know, what do they have to do to get a device or a technology that people will buy? It's a pretty arduous process, and obviously many, you know, products never make it to market, right? A lot of money goes into developing them, and they never come to fruition. So obviously, I mean, in this, you know, economic system we have, everyone's looking to be profitable, make profits. And so the problem, from my perspective, with privacy by design, security by design, if the manufacturers are not being held to basically, hey, we need to have minimum capabilities in these devices before we'll buy them, they're not going to spend the time to build that in. You know, at the highest level, that is the problem, right? So I go back to the quote I heard from the senior vice president. You know, look at who actually procures medical devices within, you know, hospitals and health systems. Is it security guys or gals? No, it's physicians, it's procurement folks, clinical engineers. Security and privacy is not a high priority item when they're looking at, you know, purchasing a device like a linear accelerator or even a wireless infusion pump. They're looking really for clinical functionality and the best value and cost, you know, that they can receive for you know, a bulk purchase. So, I mean, that's part of the problem. Privacy by design, foreign concept to most manufacturers. I work with some very large global device manufacturers. They're just starting to think about security by design, right? Privacy by design, it's a foreign concept. And I think we're probably a ways off from that. Again, because they're not, the easiest way to describe it is when they start to have impact to top line growth, you'll see change, right? When they start losing sales because, you know, their customers, large health systems, who, by the way, because of a lot of changes coming out of Affordable Care Act, I'm seeing more of a convergence between consumer devices and medical devices, and the procurement of both by the health systems and the payers. So if you look at the reimbursement model and how that's changing. So until they start to see enough business lost because they can't meet basic privacy capability that it has to be built into the device being demanded by U.S. health system and security capability, I think it's going to be a long, difficult road. Now, with that said, the FDA does play an important role. And the approach they've taken to cybersecurity of medical devices is an interesting one. It takes more of an approach to the manufacturers to say, I'm not going to tell you how to go do this. I'm not going to say what you've got to actually build in from a security perspective or privacy, but I am telling you that when you send your next pre-market approval application, you have a new device or new indication of device, and you want us to approve it so you can market it. Here's what we're looking at in terms of cybersecurity. Here's all the kind of capability that we want to see evidence that you thought about from the very conceptualization and design of the device all the way through how you built it, you tested it, post-market surveillance, and the like. That's a pretty powerful thing. I'm actually working with some manufacturers now that have gotten letters from the FDA, basically saying, hey, we've become aware of vulnerabilities in your device. You have 45 days to get back to us on what you're going to do about it. That's a pretty powerful thing. So privacy by design, security by design, I see it more of a real impact. And I know this is a privacy conference, and privacy legislation is good. I happen to like fair information practices. I think that's a better approach. I think if fair information practices was incorporated more into the procurement policies of hospitals as they're procuring devices, you'd start to see more change, right? Those are built into the actual criteria the manufacturer's got to get through to sell their device at my particular organization. You start to see change. I will stop there so we can have some time to talk more.
Thank you very much. I think, if I may, I'd like to give a small story of an innovation and maybe ask each one of you to respond from your perspectives to that particular innovation. I do not know if this was discussed in the first panel and whether it was described in it or not, but as you all know, defibrillators already have Wi-Fi enabling capabilities. And Medtronic already has products that kind of do that, and they stream your heart condition data out there. But that's still within the pure and simple device space. What we have now is connected to your iPhone, 2 sensors at the back that you just carry in your pocket. And it acts literally like a on-your-body product, along with your regular iPhone, which can be continue to be used as an iPhone, that streams an EKG constantly. Now, the stream data is meaningless unless there is actually either an automated algorithm that is analyzing it predictively for a problem you might have, or there's actually some kind of a technician who's looking at that data. So this data gets outsourced to a company in India, which is actually getting this live feed that's coming in there in India and looking at this live feed constantly. And because labor is cheap, and as they suddenly find a problem that could be a problem, they send a message on a text to the gentleman's iPhone, so they have the mobile numbers, telephone numbers of everyone. They send a message saying, stop doing what you're doing, or go to emergency, right? Or something that's very helpful, actually, especially if the person's had previous heart condition, either congestive heart failure, or a stent put in, or a bypass surgery. Could we look at it from different perspectives? And I'm going to start with you, Heather, and then Frank, as to how would the consumer react to that data going in, outsourced to a company in India, which at best has been asked to be HIPAA compliant, but which, as we have understood, for this kind of a thing, is not really fully capable of dealing with the issue?
Sure, I think that's a really interesting scenario and fairly plausible. I mean, from the data that I've collected, it seems that what's really going to be the breaking point for consumers is what happens to the information after it is kind of housed within this company in India. And then when it comes back to the cell phone, where else is that information going? You know, is it being transmitted somehow to insurance companies, to other entities, and what are the restrictions on that? And, you know, I think as long as people can be reassured that this is a clinical medical device and that safeguards are being taken and kind of all necessary precautions, the default for users is going to be to trust it, because this is, you know, historically we have built a relationship with our medical providers, with our healthcare providers, and, you know, whether people's intuitions about where health data actually goes is correct or not, because I think people actually don't realize that their medical information, especially once it's in an electronic medical record, for example, is accessible to perhaps hundreds of different entities. LaTanya Sweeney does great work on this, on her health map. But regardless, I think people are predisposed to be trusting in those contexts. But the question is kind of what happens when it's mixed with this commercial bit, and I don't know the answer to that.
So I wanted to also connect this to two things that are sort of going on right now with pacemaker data, I believe from Medtronic or a similar company, which is that right now there was a Wall Street Journal article a few years ago saying that patients cannot get access to the data from their own pacemaker. They're told that essentially they need a doctor to interpret the data. And what you're mentioning, Falcone, in terms of the alternative of just having the phone, a fascinating thing that I would have to ask a doctor about, whether the data from the sensor on your wrist or something like that could ever be as high quality as the data from the lead that's on your heart, or on the, wherever it is on the heart. That's a tough question, and this is coming up with CPAP machines, all sorts of devices. There's a conflict now over those sorts of issues. I want to just raise one issue that I know will be highly controversial probably at a privacy conference, but which I think is something that, you know, needs to be raised at a conference like this with health data, which is the potential for a moral duty. I mean, to the extent there is consent bias, the potential for a moral duty to be part of large-scale observational research. And I know that Michelle Meyer has done some work on this, this issue of data altruists and others. But, you know, I mean, as someone that sort of talks regularly with people in a large healthcare system, and as someone who's been a caregiver for, who was a caregiver for many years for someone who had complex health issues, and who felt continually, I felt continually frustrated by the lack of good data. I am very enthusiastic about interoperability and data aggregation when there's proper anonymization. And so I think that it is not just a matter of the individual decision, or I think that there's always sort of a social element. So I do think that this is an area where, the final issue and the final paradox I'll bring up is, if we don't have the use restrictions that Scott Peppett was discussing, giving someone access to their data can be a poison chalice. Because essentially, if you suddenly get access to the Medtronic data, and your employer and everyone else can ask for it, do you want it?
All great points. Building off of both Frank and Heather's points, you know, coming at it from a design perspective, I'd like to see some basic controls built into the device to give user configurable controls back to fair information practices, like access and ability to at least understand at some aggregated level who has touched the data, right? And some audit capabilities. And because I think, to Heather's earlier point, if I as a healthcare consumer, and I'm dealing obviously with whatever, you know, issues that I'm dealing with, I have to be worried about a very complex health system and a complex technology infrastructure. And is that adding more stress to my life? I mean, I'd rather trust that, you know, the clinical team I'm working with are abiding by the privacy practices specified, at least in this country, in HIPAA, right? And they tell you up front, you know, this is how we're going to use your data and where it might go. I want to trust that that actually works, but I want to verify. I want to have some basic controls built into these devices collecting information about me that I can verify for myself if I want.
Did you say that in India the data are being reviewed by humans?
Yes.
Okay. So because it's reviewed by humans, you have obviously a new legal issue we haven't talked about, the unauthorized practice of medicine. I mean, you have people basically remotely diagnosing and telling you what to do. If it were automated, if it were analytic, then that whole system would be a medical device and regulated as such to the highest level, which will frankly keep that from ever happening, right? At least in our lifetime.
Maybe we have time for one question or most two. Lady back there.
Hello, Françoise Gamet, Fordham alumna. I had a question because when we listen all of you, it seems that company, I mean, their first priority is obviously not security or privacy. That we knew, and the way they put it in their policies might be, we want to think that it might be deceiving for people because they are either they are not sophisticated enough. I don't believe it's a point because whatever, as an individual, when you get on and you want to get something from the internet, you usually have to, in order to gain access, you have to scroll down 15 pages of something that is completely not understandable for most people, and that pretty repetitive too. I know because I've translated some of this policy in the past in French, so I know what it means. And then basically the companies, this is not their top priority. The individuals, they might be interested in what will happen to their information. But in order to use whatever they want to use, they will still have to say agree underneath and go further. So if companies are not interested, individuals, sophisticated or not, are interested but not enough to give up on certain things. Do you think, any of you, that there is any other way to get a minimum level of respect of privacy and security other than through regulation? A few years ago with Professor Reidenberg, we talked a lot about the role of the trust in the network, and that basically if people got so upset about what was happening to them, that would be such an uproar.
Yeah, we got the question. We're short of time, so
sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so you're really talking about walk-away consent, right? If somebody wants to use a particular product and they have to agree to that company's privacy policy if they want to use it. If they don't agree but they still want to use it, I mean, they're in a difficult position. You'll say you agree so that you can. So, I mean, maybe we could establish some system whereby you agree, the privacy policy itself is constructed such that all of the, this is kind of my dream, all of the settings are private by default, and users can go in after the fact and selectively actually decide what pieces of information they agree to be transmitted. So it's kind of a, I don't know, it's I suppose a two-stage process. You agree to go on and then adjust the settings to conform to your own preferences. Very idealistic.
Anybody else wants to respond? Well, thank you very much. With wonderful panel. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you.